Hello students, welcome to the first session for the next chapter for 9th standard science. Well, in the last chapter we have discussed very well about the organisms, that the living organisms are made up of the cells, and how a single cellular organism, that is the amoeba, it performs many functions like ingestion, digestion, absorption. But in case of the multicellular organisms, that is the organisms made up of many cells, there all these functions are not performed by a single cell, but they are performed by a group of cells. And these group of cells, when they group together, they perform a particular function. Just as, for example, the nerve cells, they perform the function for the transfer of the messages from one part of the body to the other part. Exactly in a similar way, the blood cells, they are responsible for the transport of the RBCs, specifically for the transport of the respiratory gases. The WBCs, that is the white blood cells, acting as the soldiers of the body, and the blood platelets, responsible for the blood clotting purpose. So all these cells, they group together and they perform a particular function. And these cells, they are now known as a tissue. So the chapter that we shall focus on today is the tissue. So let us see the definition of a tissue. So basically, a group of cells, when they unite together to perform a specific or a basic function, is known as a tissue. Now, the question arises, are the tissues present in plants and animals, are they of the same type? The answer is absolutely no. The tissues in plants and the tissues in case of the animals, they are far more different from each other. Now, how they are different? There are various categories of it. The first one is the stationary and moving. Plants are stationary. Plants are not moving from one place to the other, while the animals are easily moving from one place to the other. So the tissues in case of the plants, they help in having a particular strength to maintain themselves at a particular place. While in case of the animals, as they are moving from one place to the other, they have specific tissues for moving from one place to the other, like the muscle cells will be there. And the second one is the pattern of the growth. In case of the plants, the growth is unlimited, while in case of the animals, the growth is limited up to a certain extent. So the tissues in case of the plants, they will be helping the plants to increase the length of the plant throughout their lifetime. While in case of the animals, there are certain tissues that will be helping them to normalize the organs, normalize the growth only up to a certain age. And after that, the growth of the body ultimately deteriorates. The aging ultimately starts. So these are the various things that, yes, the differences are observed in case of the plants and animals in relation to the tissues. Now let us see the classification of the tissue. So here is the entire chart, that is a pictorial representation of the tissue. If you observe very well, we focus on the plant tissues first of all. So focusing on the plant tissues are mainly categorized into the two basic parts. The first one, that is the meristematic tissue, and the other is the permanent tissue. Now the meristematic tissue is further categorized into the three basic types, that is the apical meristem, the intercalary meristem, and the lateral meristem. Furthermore, the permanent tissue is been categorized into the two basic types, the simple permanent and the complex permanent. Now simple permanent has the parenchyma, the collenchyma and the sclerenchyma. This parenchyma further is classified into the chlorenchyma and the erenchyma. Moving on into the complex permanent tissue. The complex permanent tissue is basically categorized into the xylem and the phloem. And this xylem has a lot of subcategories as well as the phloem. Now, first of all, we shall start with the meristematic tissue. Now, what do we understand by the word meristematic? Now, meristematic basically means the constantly dividing cells. So, these cells, they constantly keep on dividing. And the nucleus content is there at a particular region of the cell. Vacuoles are very much negligible and they have a dense cytoplasm with very thin cellulose. Let us go into the categories of it. So based on the location of the cells, this meristematic tissue is further categorized into three basic types: the apical meristem, the intercalary meristem and the lateral meristem. The first one, that is the apical meristem. From the name itself, apical means something which is present at the top, something which is present at the apex, that is said to be the apical. So this apical meristematic tissue is mainly and exclusively present at the tips of the roots and the shoots. So it is mainly responsible for increasing the length of the roots and the shoots. The second one, that is the intercalary meristem. Now this intercalary meristem has a special property of taking up the water and other minerals from the roots and increasing the length, that is the elongation of the stems and the roots also. And the third one, that is the lateral meristem. It will also be taking up the various major substances that it requires, and it is responsible for increasing the girth of the entire stem. Girth means the breadth of the entire stem is because of the lateral meristem. From the name itself, lateral means the sides. So here is the entire thing about the apical meristem, the lateral meristem and the intercalary meristem. Furthermore, this intercalary meristematic tissue is also present at the nodes and the internodes. Now what are these nodes and the internodes? Now node, the place from where the leaf arises, is known as the nodes. So that region from where the leaf arises is said to be a typical node. And the region between the two successive nodes, successive means one after the other. So the region between the two successive nodes is known as the internode. Just as if you observe a particular finger, so there are certain marks on the finger. So if a leaf arises from this mark, and if another leaf arises from this mark, then this mark, these two marks are said to be the nodes. And the region between the two successive nodes is said to be the internodes. So this intercalary meristem is responsible for increasing the length of this internode also. Now let us focus on the permanent tissue. Now why it is said to be a permanent tissue and how it becomes a permanent tissue. So basically when the meristematic tissue, which is a constantly dividing cell, when the meristematic tissue or when the cells of the meristematic tissue When they stop dividing, it basically forms the permanent tissue. This permanent tissue is mainly categorized into the two basic types: the simple permanent tissue and the complex permanent tissue. Now talking about the first one, that is the simple permanent tissue. Now why this simple permanent tissue is said to be a simple one? Because the cells in this simple permanent tissue are of the same kind. There is no such sort of differentiation inside it. There are no subtypes that they have. The first one, that is the parenchyma. Now the parenchyma tissue is said to be the stuffing tissue. Whenever or wherever there is any sort of space in a typical root or stem or a particular leaf, then that is basically filled up by the parenchymatous tissue. The cell wall is basically thin in nature with substantial amount of the cytoplasm with a typical nucleus. There are a lot of spaces in between the cells also. So it is slightly loose in nature up to a certain extent. Furthermore, if the parenchyma is having the chlorophyll content inside it, it becomes the chlorenchyma. And such a parenchyma having the chlorophyll is said to be the chlorenchyma, which performs the function of photosynthesis as it is having the chlorophyll content. Furthermore, the parenchyma having the air spaces inside it is said to be the arenchyma. And this arenchyma is mainly responsible for the purpose of buoyancy. Buoyancy means the ability to float. So the leaves of certain plants like the lotus, they float on the surface of water because of the arenchyma. Moving on from the parenchyma, the second one, that is the collenchyma. This collenchyma is said to be a living mechanical tissue. The cell wall is basically thick at certain regions only. Furthermore, it provides mechanical strength to the entire plant. So the flexibility of the plant is because of this living mechanical tissue. So where it is mainly located? So it is mainly located below the epidermis. Epidermis is the outermost layer of a particular root, stem or the leaf. So below the epidermis, this collenchyma is mainly present. So the flexibility of the plant is because of the collenchyma. In short, whenever the wind blows and the plant ultimately bends up to a certain extent because of the wind, and when that wind goes, the plant comes back to its normal position. That is because of the collenchyma. Moving on to the third one, that is the sclerenchyma. Sclerenchyma is said to be a dead mechanical tissue. The cells of this tissue are mainly dead in nature. So where it is mainly present? It is also present at certain regions below the epidermis also, and mainly present at the dead tissues of certain fruits also and certain regions of the plant. Just as the husk of the coconut, the outermost region of the coconut, there it is made up of this sclerenchyma. Furthermore, the outermost region of the nuts, the walnuts, it is basically made up of this sclerenchyma. So that is the entire thing about the simple permanent tissue, right from the parenchyma to the collenchyma and then to the sclerenchyma. Well, the outermost regions of a typical root or the stem or the leaf is said to be the epidermis. And now the cells of this epidermis are basically single layered with some sort of space in between the cells and that too in certain regions of the plant only. These cells, they show some sort of thickening, and that thickening is present on the top and on the sides, not on the region of the inner side. Now, in case of the desert plants, where the scarcity of water is there the outer layer of the epidermis becomes very much thicker, so that the evaporation of water does not take place and the water loss does not occur very much. While in case of certain aquatic plants as well as in certain aerial plants, they have some sort of stomata on the surface of the leaves, that is at the epidermal region. Now let us see a typical structure of a stomata. So here is a pictorial representation of the stomata. Now these stomatas, they are minute pores which are known as the stomatal pore. They are guarded, they are covered by a pair of bean shaped or the kidney shaped cells known as the guard cells. And these guard cells, they are further covered by the accessory cells. And the opening and the closing of the stomata is because of the guard cells. When the guard cells, they take up a lot of water, the pore will open and the exchange of the gases will be taking place. And when the guard cells, they lose water, ultimately the pore will ultimately be getting closed and the exchange of the gases will not be taking place. Now as the plants, they grow older, the epidermis of the plant is basically replaced by the inner layer of the cells known as the secondary meristem, and that ultimately responsible for the hardening of the stem, which we call it as the cork, C-O-R-K. That becomes so hard so that the water and other substances, they cannot enter through it. So basically it becomes impervious. Impervious means impermeable to water and other substances. So that is the entire thing about the parenchyma, the sclerenchyma, the collenchyma and the layers of the epidermis. Now moving on to the complex permanent tissue. Now why this complex permanent tissue is basically known as the complex one? Because here there are many differentiations in case of the cells, and the two major tissue that is responsible for making this complex permanent tissue work, they are the xylem and the phloem. And these two, xylem and phloem, are also said to be the conducting tissues or the vascular tissues also. Now why they are said to be a conducting or the vascular tissue? From the name itself, conducting, they are responsible for the conduction, the transportation of various substances in the entire plant. Now talking about the first one, that is the xylem. So here are the various differentiations of the xylem, that is the trachea, the tracheids, xylem parenchyma and xylem fibers, out of which the trachea and the tracheids are responsible for the transport of the water from the ground level to the top level, and in doing so they do not require any sort of energy. So no use of ATP is there. ATP means the adenosine triphosphate, that is the energy currency of the cell. Exactly in a similar way, the xylem fibers, they are responsible for providing some sort of mechanical strength. Like the xylem, the other complex permanent tissue, that is the phloem, it is mainly responsible for the transfer of the food substances from the leaves to the other regions of the plant. But here they do require the energy content, that is the ATP. Furthermore, the components of the phloem are sieve cells, sieve tube cells, the companion cells, the phloem fibers, and the other phloem structures also. Now, out of which the sieve cells and the sieve tube cells, they are ultimately responsible for the transfer and the transport of the food substances. And this transport of the food substances that is done by the phloem is said to be the translocation. So the transport of water is known as the transportation, while the transport of food is known as the translocation. So that's all we have in relation to the plant tissues. Right from the meristematic tissue with the apical meristem, the intercalary meristem, and the lateral meristem. Then we went on into the permanent tissue, where we did the simple and the complex one. The simple permanent tissue having the parenchyma, the collenchyma, and the sclerenchyma. And last but not the least, the complex permanent tissue having the xylem and the phloem content. Well, in the next class, we shall discuss in much detail about the animal tissues. Thank you very much.